first opening panel, and Stuart will introduce his fantastic panelists. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Stuart Wood, and thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to have you all here at our school, Blavatnik School of Government. We thought, given the challenges of government theme, that there's no better place to start, given the size of the challenge, than Europe, a continent that's had a mission for the last 60 years that whether you're interested in migration, whether you're interested in the economy, whether you're interested in the political sustainability of the European Union, or in terms of the foreign policy impact of the EU, crisis is a word that looms pretty large across the piece. Fortunately, we have a panel, 4 people, who in the course of an hour and 5 minutes will dispel any doubts about the future of the European Union. And maybe the panel could come up to the chairs and I'll introduce you in turn. We have Sir Paul Collier, Professor of Economics and Public Policy here at the Blavatnik School of Government. Sir Paul's work, as I'm sure you know, is fated his work on civil war, on the effects of aid, the problems of democracy, and recently who is a member of the European Parliament for the Dutch Democratic Party, D66. She is the ALDE coordinator on the International Trade Committee. She's spokesperson on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and has extensive work in human rights and foreign policy. So, Marietje, thank you very much for coming. We have Helena Kennedy, one of the UK's most distinguished lawyers, colleague of mine in the House of Lords, now chair of the European Union Subcommittee on Law in the House of Lords. She also now runs Mansfield College here in Oxford, and has been a champion of law reform for women and more broadly for a number of years. Welcome, Helena. And lastly, but not least at all, we have Professor Robert Toombs from Cambridge University at St John's College, who's a specialist in French history, but also a specialist in English and Franco-English and Franco-British relations, and has written most recently about 13 centuries of English history. Robert, thank you very much for coming. So we're going to start by having many of the panels will start with a framing question from a member of our student body, and I'm going to ask Vincent here, if he gets the microphone, to ask a framing question before I hand over for a short presentation from the panel. Vincent.
Thank you very much. I'm Vincent. I'm an MPP student and I'm German, and being German these days, it's very ambivalent. First, Germany is told to destroy Europe and the Euro crisis, then it's seen as its savior in the refugee crisis. However, the European idea has been severely damaged by both events, and nowadays we're talking about the reopening of borders at the Brenner Tunnel and the end of Schengen. Is there any hope for Europe? And if so, how can trust in the European idea can be restored?
Thank you. Paul, maybe we can start with you. Not only as a distinguished economist, but also someone who's looked specifically at migration in your recent work. Do you see the recent migration crisis as spelling the death knell for the European Union as we've known it?
Well, I hope it spells the death knell of ever closer union. I work mainly on failing states, fragile states. And one fundamental characteristic of failing fragile states is a mismatch between the structure of identities in a society and the structure of power. And I smell in ever closer union the attempt to build a failing state. Fortunately, it's not going to happen. I think about 15 years ago, Europe stumbled into the desperate dreams of nearly dead old men and moved on from a structure of cooperation between states, which is very important. Europe, full of middle-sized countries, big opportunities for cooperation between states, and having a structure which maintains that cooperation, makes it easy, is really valuable. But the dead old men decided to rush things, since they were then nearly dead, and what they rushed into was symbols. And so they created a couple of symbols of the United States of America if the United States of America has a common currency, we want one. If the United States of America has open borders, we want one. And so the symbols of the euro and Schengen were, frankly, idiotic. Any economist could have told them that having a common currency over an area without common labour market institutions, common inflation expectations, so on and so forth, would crash, which it has. It's produced tragedy in southern Europe, unemployment rates amongst youth desperately high, dangerously high. Right? As to be expected, there's a backlash across Europe, and so I think what we'll gradually revert to, because most of the dead old men really are now dead, is back to the Europe of cooperation. And the Europe of cooperation is very useful indeed. So if I believed that we were hell-bent on ever closer union, I'd say no thank you. But I don't. I think actually we've had a flurry, a flirtation with the dreams of dead old men, and we'll back off from that. What we'll end up with is something that's very useful. So I want to stay in Europe because I think Britain has the best of all possible worlds. We ducked the two stupid bullets. We're not in the euro, we're not in Schengen, but we are at the heart of discussions on policy. We have got the veto, so I want us to stay in. If we leapt out, we'd be in uncharted territory. But that is not a ringing endorsement of ever closer union.
But can I just ask a follow-up before we go on to Marietje, who I suspect may have a slightly different view, but is the folly of the European Union so far that you're talking about, is it primarily an economic one, or do you think it's overstretched on other areas to do with foreign policy, maybe with optimism about the integration of peoples as well?
Well, I think, as I say, the basic folly is the belief that you can build a United States of Europe when the structures of identities will not support that. I mean, very few people in Europe primarily feel European, probably less now than 30 years ago. You know, I mean, the one thing that kind of unites most of Europe is that most Europeans don't like Germans. And Germans feel uncomfortable about being German as well. But that's not really how you build a state, is it? But there's a big basis for cooperation, but not a basis for centralized power. That's the heart of the problem.
Marietje, maybe over to you, as someone who works at the heart of European Union institutions. I mean, do you share that pessimism about where next for the European Union? And as someone presumably who spends their time trying to work out how to correct some of these problems, what do you think the projects are that we should be embracing?
I don't see mine as a pessimistic view.
I apologise. Mine was I apologise. It wasn't meant to be a pejorative characterisation. Marietje.
Well, I mean, I'm going to try my best to counter the notion of the dream of desperate, nearly dead old men. I think we really need to zoom out and not get caught in attacking these symbols of ever closer union. I mean, symbols were important in drafting a vision after the Second World War in trying to get people to look at one point at the horizon. But of course, what we need more is not attacks on symbols, but a pragmatic approach to where we can cooperate and how we can strengthen ourselves in a time where I think challenges coming from outside of the EU are significant. I'll speak a little bit more about my visit to Turkey that I returned from last night in a little bit, but I really think that we have to be careful not to be too inward focused and looking at relatively small differences between, indeed, there are differences in the identities of European countries, but on a global scale, the shared history, the shared values, the shared interests, first and foremost, that we have in this part of the world. And the main challenge of preserving the quality of life that we have here, which is still very, very high on a global scale, the enormous freedom and opportunity for young people, I think should not be pushed aside so easily. And I really think it is worth fighting for. It must be fought for. And of course, there's a need to change and improve the governance of the Union, make it more democratic, to involve people more. But the best way to do that is to sit at the table in a constructive manner. not to try to destroy the very, very basics, which I think is a risk, particularly in this country. If we look at the discussion around the referendum, I've heard such outrageous statements about what the union is or is not about, that it is, for example, a totalitarian state. Well, I invite those to have a look at how real totalitarian states function, and it's not difficult to spot the differences. So I think we owe it to ourselves to be better than that, and to be more serious about the discussion, because I do think that this is a very crucial moment. Now, I thought we were also supposed to address geopolitics a little bit. Is that okay? Because I think there's one example of where we are now in terms of the impact of Europe, which touches upon a lot of the fundamental questions. I just returned from a trip to Turkey, where, of course, the implications of the deal that is made between the European Union and Turkey on the settlement of refugees is a very, very hot topic. And it is remarkable to see the extent to which the European Union matters in a country like Turkey, for better and worse. But I think if we look at the countries around us, if we look at North Africa, our eastern neighborhood, it is very clear that the values that we share here, or at least that are the foundation of the European area, still have a lot of meaning for people. And I think we should be much more aware of the strategic implications of our vision and approach to our neighborhood. There's a young generation in the countries around us that really needs to have a perspective on how they can form a life that they can shape themselves, where they have opportunities, economically speaking, where they have a more just and free society. And I fear that some of the discussions that we're having in the EU about our immediate self-interest, for example, as a result of refugees coming to the European Union, overshadows the bigger picture and takes away from the political leadership that we also need to devote to strengthening our foreign and security policies at a time where there's frankly quite a few threats in our immediate neighborhood that are being overlooked right now.
And as someone who works on foreign policy, do you think there's a case in response to that challenge to have a more coordinated, not just foreign policy, but use of military forces across the European Union? Is there a case for more integration and coordination than there has been so far?
Absolutely. It's not a luxury, but a necessity to work together more towards the EU being a global player and to pool our resources when it comes to defense. It makes no sense that we're spending enormous amounts, but we're really only focusing on basic capacity because each of the member states are doing their own defense planning. So you have a very broad basic capacity. You have no, or not enough at least, strategic coordination on, for example, which capacities are developed by one country over another. There's a lot of room for budget cuts if we coordinate and cooperate better. And there certainly is a need to be able to have the defense capacity as a last resort. Europe, its huge strength in foreign policy is and should remain, I believe, its soft power. But it only works if you can back it up with hard power if it's necessary. I mean, I think it is unacceptable that we don't see the EU as a key player at the table in the talks about Syria, while we are on the receiving end of the consequences of that ongoing terrible war. We allow Russia and the United States and a number of Middle Eastern countries to decide what the outcome is going to be, whereas I think we should have been the ones initiating major diplomatic initiatives, but we can only credibly negotiate if we can back it up with hard power if it's necessary, and for that we need more cooperation.
Before we move on to Helena, I mean, to be devil's advocate, you could say, going back to what Paul said, that the political moment is one in which populations of European states think that this is a time to perhaps, if not freeze, then reverse and retrench the drift towards greater European power. Is this not the wrong moment, or politically an unsellable moment for the kind of thing that you're talking about?
No, it's talking about. Yes, I think it's important that I explain my position in that I'm pro-European, I'm an internationalist. You'll hear that I'm a Scot, but I was not a Scot in favour of separating off, because I really do believe that strength comes through our cooperating and coming together. I don't agree with Paul about in his dismissal of sad old men. because the European project, and while I think it's right it went off on wrong tangents, it is a wonderful vision, and it came out of sad old men who'd experienced war. And we should never forget that was what informed what those old men held as their vision. And one of the sad things is that too many people have forgotten what the purpose of the European Union was, and it was more than European Union around economics. It was about sort of a coming together in a grand project which was about peace and justice. So let's never forget that was where its roots were. And I think that there's still an urgency for that, and if we look around Europe, we can see it. There, at the moment, is the rise of far-right parties. And many of those parties forget, they romanticize their own nation state, but they forget the purposes for which the European Union was originally brought together. And I saw that the statistics, the polling, suggested that when David Cameron at the beginning of last week spoke about this business, that it was about an end to war, that most of the people who were polled sort of didn't think that was a very significant reason or rationale for staying in the European Union. I actually still think it is. On the business of going off on wrong directions, I was never in favour of our joining the euro, and I was very glad that we didn't, we Britain. But I still hold very strongly to the ways in which cooperation, as Paul's described it, is absolutely vital in operating within a globalised world. But globalisation, and when you brought back in, and it's important, our questioner was asking about, are we, because of migration and because of the great crisis of migration, are we actually seeing this all disintegrate, this coming together in some strength? And I think globalisation does present us with very, very real challenges. And I think that we're feeling the force of it. But part of it is to do with, of course, the commitment to neoliberal economics. It's how I see it. And I think that the divisions between rich and poor and the sharing of the great, wealth of the world has not taken place in the way that globalization should have made possible. Yes, we've seen some nations become much better off and have seen the benefits of globalization. I work often with women in parts of the world where their human rights are constantly being degraded. And yet at the same time, the opportunity to take part in the economy for women can be a liberating experience. Even although they might not be paid very much money and we're worried about exploitation, they would say, this liberates me and gives me money in my hand, which means I can say no to forced marriage, no to behavior from partners and husbands and fathers that is unacceptable, and that independence is so important to them. So, economic change has been taking place in positive ways, but in some places it hasn't happened. And so you're going to see continuing migration if we don't see, in the world, a greater distribution of our assets. I'm a lawyer. I'm a human rights lawyer. I chair the Institute of Human Rights for the International Bar Association, a global organization of bar associations. And I recently co-chaired a task force on climate change and human rights. You might immediately think, climate change and human rights, where does that come together? It comes together very powerfully, because as people are unable to make a livelihood in the center of Africa because it's becoming a desert, unable to maintain their livelihoods on the edges of nations because of the rising of oceans, people are moving. And so you're going to see those pictures of seeing people on boats in oceans and on seas are going to continue. And it will not just be the Mediterranean, but people will move in desperation in order to make a life. And we make a great distinction, we as lawyers, between those who are seeking a new life because of persecution, because of war, who are fleeing as refugees, and those who are migrant travelers. But in fact, if you are so desperate that you're not going to survive, it's almost hard to make those distinctions sometimes between those who are economic migrants and those who are actually desperately fleeing terrible circumstances. So I think that the crisis on migration, which was what our question was to open this up, our crisis on migration is actually hones in on some of the major issues around the divide between rich and poor in our world, and indeed even within Europe. Because in the expanded Europe, we have a great difference between those who are earning the sort of money you earn in Britain, and if you're a Romanian, the sort of money you earn there. And so, of course, you are getting that movement within the European Union itself. There was a great mocking, in fact, of Jeremy Corbyn when he made the suggestion that we should actually be working towards living wages across Europe. And it seemed to me a very sensible way of dealing with some of the migrant issues that we've got, of people who come here in numbers that frighten the population here in Britain, but come from Eastern Europe because there's such a difference in what your earning power is. So I think that the migration issue, the whole business of refugees, the business of the war in the Middle East, and the role that we played in that, I think all of that impacts on decisions that are having to be made now. Now, I'm a lawyer. I chair I sit on the European Union Select Committee in the House of Lords. Now, many of you are from different parts of the world, and you all think that's that part of the British Constitution that's rather weird and full of old folk. I'm young in the House of Lords, I want you all to know. And it's full of very sad old men. But most of those sad old men actually, and many of them actually, don't want to stay in the European Union because they're so romantic about how Britain used to be. There cannot be a return to how Britain used to be, nor can there be a return to the way that most nations used to be. And so those retreats into nationalism, I think, are very dangerous. And I think that we have to really think through what the future holds for us. As a lawyer, I chair this committee, and the committees in the House of Lords are actually wonderful committees, and they're greatly respected. And the House of Lords European Union Committee, I think Mariette would tell you, is highly respected across Europe because of the work that we do on accountability in relation to the European Union and what comes out of the European Union. I chaired this recent committee on justice, and I look at justice issues across the whole of Europe. And all I'm telling you is, if we didn't have that kind of cooperation on law that goes across borders, then we would be in trouble. You have to have it. And you have to have it particularly because of globalization. Much of my work in the courts is around the whole business of crime and problems that cross borders. And climate change, of course, is one of them. Migration is another of them. But so too is the trafficking of women and children. So too is the trafficking of arms and fissile material, the trafficking of body parts, the trafficking of human eggs, the trafficking of babies. And so these things are coming before our courts, and you need to have collaboration on them. And we in Europe have a particular warrant system, arrest warrant system, which makes it possible for us to put our hands on people who've been responsible for crime within our own borders. So for me, staying in Europe is vital. And we have to remember all the good stuff that comes from that. And the same is true in other parts of the world. Nations working together on the problems that are presented bring strength rather than weakness.
Thanks. So before we come on to Robert, I think Paul wanted to respond.
Just a quick thing on where you started.
Sad old men.
No, not sad old men.
Oh, we had a lot of sad
return
old
to
men
war.
here.
War.
Yeah.
War. And what I wanted to make was the point that the European Union is a consequence of the revulsion against war, but not a cause of European peace. And just to make that point, let me ask you whether you think you feel safe. Both the Netherlands and Norway were invaded by Germany in the 1940s. Right? The Netherlands is in the European Union, it's in the Euro. Norway is not in the European Union, it's not in the Euro. Do you think you feel safer from invasion by Germany than the Norwegians do?
Are you talking about today?
Yeah.
I don't fear it at all. I think it is.
Do you think the Norwegians fear it?
No.
No, obviously. So it's nothing to do with the European Union.
No. It's very different. No, I'm trying to find the anchor in this discussion. I think it is true that more mutual dependence and a more shared interest economically has led to decreased interest in fighting each other. I think that that's true. And I think the fact that there has been a joint effort to rebuild Germany after the war has been crucial in taking away the tensions in Europe. So I don't agree with your premise that the EU has not resulted in a more peaceful and more cooperative spirit in Europe. But I don't
invade anybody again.
Well, it's always difficult to say never, but I certainly hope not. And I also think that the images of a hated Germany. You also said Germany something along the lines of destroyed Europe in the Eurozone crisis. I think those are very strong statements that we have to be careful about. The German economy is an anchor for this area of the world. And in fact, I believe that a lot of the economies in Southern European countries would have collapsed because of a mismanagement of public funds. And it's very sad that the young generation pays the price for this, and that we still see a lack of willingness to do structural reforms that are needed. And I think that those problems would have surfaced with or without EU membership, because they are the direct result of the governments of these states themselves. So let's also be careful not to use terms along the lines of war and peace too frivolously. I think that in the debate in this country around the referendum, we've seen very strong words, as I mentioned before, used in a loose way that I think is irresponsible. And you asked a question about, populations don't want more cooperation, such as in the area of defense. I mean, who are populations? Yes, indeed, we see a contingent of more nationalist voices on the left and the right, and I think this should concern us all very much. But I also see a sort of paralyzed political leadership that doesn't even attempt to explain to people why it is we need to work together. For me, it's not a problem to say we need to work towards a European army, but it's a taboo in a number of countries. They only want to talk about cooperation. Well, fine, let's talk about cooperation and why we need it. Why we're wasting money now by not cooperating, why we're weak on a global stage that doesn't allow us to be weak. I think we face a problem of leadership in the political middle at the moment that doesn't sufficiently challenge the nationalist movements, fails to explain why we have European cooperation in the first place. And then we shouldn't be surprised that if instead of showing this kind of leadership, and in fact also being accountable for decisions that these government leaders make themselves when they sit at the Brussels negotiating and cooperation tables, they fail to explain why compromise is needed, they fail to explain why it's in the national interest to work together on a European level. And as a result of that, instead of showing this kind of leadership from the middle, but rather flirting with the niches on the left and the right, or the emergence of growing parties on the left and the right, there's nobody defending the middle. And I think that is the risk that we're facing. And so I also want to be careful about saying that the people don't want this, the people don't want that. I think the people want to have a view on how, a perspective, a vision on how the quality of life in this part of the world is going to be preserved, because it is no longer automatic that our children and our children's children are going to have the same level of economic welfare as past generations had. There is concern about threats from terrorism. There is concern about how we're dealing with refugees and migrants coming to Europe. And of course, those are legitimate concerns. We have to address them. But I think on a number of issues, you will find that the best way to deal with them is by cooperating.
Let me Robert in at this point.
Say something.
Finally letting you in. The floor is yours. I'd be interested from a historian's point of view. For centuries, the idea of Britain and France cooperating in the European Union must have seemed like a fantastic notion. But do you think we'll look back and think about the period since the second half of the 20th century as an aberrant period in the long historical view?
Oh, I hope not. But Britain and France did set up what's been called the first common market in the 1860s. So there's nothing particularly new about having free trade, movement of peoples, investment, and so on in Europe. The EU is not the inventor of it. Indeed, it's been around for quite a long time. Globalization is really a 18th and 19th century phenomenon. But I'm both more optimistic and more pessimistic than the other members of the panel. More optimistic about Europe. Europe is not the EU, of course, in that European countries' cohesion, their wealth, their resilience is based on a very great depth of what we'd probably call social capital: education, political habits, the ability to live together and make institutions work. All these things go back a long way. They're habits that have often been learned very painfully, but they're there, and I don't think there's any great danger of Europe, as it were, disappearing from the world stage and becoming irrelevant, which was our question. Indeed, if you think purely in material terms of power, these things change very slowly. If you think which were the half dozen or so most powerful countries in the world in the 300 years ago, they're more or less the same as today, with the exception of America, which arrives on the scene. But the most powerful countries were China, India, Britain, France, Germany, they still are. There's no reason to think that will change very much. And it seems to me the countries over which there is a serious question mark in the medium term are the very large units. Let's hope not America with Mr. Trump. Let's assume that's an aberration. But China, India, Brazil, these are the countries facing real problems, the problems that Europe faced in the 19th century, of very rapid urbanisation, very rapid population growth, very rapid social change. And it's not at all clear that they will come through any more painlessly than Europe did in 1848 or 1871 and so on. Let's hope they do. But it's not necessarily the case that they will, and Europe may well still remain a haven of peace and prosperity. Okay, so that's my optimism. My pessimism is that Europe is suffering from a great many self-inflicted wounds, which go back to 1914, the great seminal catastrophe of modern times. And the EU was certainly a well-meaning, though I think in some ways misguided attempt to heal some of these wounds. Misguided mainly because of its suspicion of democracy and particularly of national democracies, its mistrust of the people. Okay, there were reasons for that. After all, the people had elected Hitler and they'd more or less elected Mussolini. So you might say, well, there were reasons to be suspicious of the peoples of Europe and of the European nations. The problem is what happens when you deliberately try to downplay democracy. Europe, it seems to me, is built on the idea that an elite, the sort of people who are sitting on this platform, I'm the exception.
That's why I didn't let you speak.
The sort of elite who are inside these circles and who know that they're doing their best and that nothing better can be done. Now, where I'm more pessimistic again is that the euro is much more than just a symbol. It may have begun as a symbol, but I think it was always more than that. It was an instrument of power. It was essentially a desire on the part of France to control Germany. The euro has become a straitjacket. It's become politically and economically devastating. The whole of southern Europe has suffered enormously from the euro. Okay, you can say, well, they made mistakes. Their governments made mistakes. But the problem is the systemic structure of the euro means that they can't get out of the consequence of their mistakes. What they ought to do and what they would have done is to devalue their currencies. A lot of economists say they should be devalued by 20 or 30%. You can't do that, and therefore all you can do, as in the time of the gold standard in the 1920s, is mass unemployment, reducing people's wages, cutting government spending in a time of austerity. It's amazing, really, that worse things have not happened so far politically. But I'm afraid, although this is not only an EU problem, the EU has aggravated that problem and acts as a kind of political black hole. It sucks away political power and legitimacy to its institutions, but then it can't actually use that power. It's as if it disappears into some void. It can't solve the euro problem. It can't solve the immigration problem. What does it do? It hopes for the best. It hopes that something will turn up. There is no major reform program on the table. And the reason is that European politicians know that their peoples will not accept them. So they know that something has got to be done differently, but they don't know what. And if they think they do know what, there's a report by the so-called 5 presidents, they know it won't be accepted. So you're stuck in this kind of void. Well, I'm afraid perhaps I'm the only person in the room, the only person on the platform who thinks that Britain should leave the EU, because I feel that in at least the medium to long term, we will be sucked inevitably into this black hole. And I think the answer is not a retreat to nationalism, which Baroness Kennedy rightly warned against, but a retreat to democracy. The democracy and the nation state are more or less synonymous. There is no democracy without a sense of national solidarity and accountability. If Europe has a future, it has to be based much more on cooperation between legitimate, democratic national governments and not on supranational and essentially undemocratic, or the polite word is non-majoritarian institutions. Now, the problem is I have no idea how you get to that. I don't know how you dismantle the euro. And so unless you can find a way to do that, it seems to me there's no way out of the present situation. And don't forget what's happening it's not only governments of the right, or parties of the right, it's also parties of the extreme left. Think about what's happening in Portugal, in Spain, in Catalonia, in Italy, in Greece, in Austria right now, in Germany. Lots of attacks on migrants, violent attacks on migrants, very commonly, in Holland even. even in Scandinavia, which we looked at as being a kind of, you know, the ark of the covenant of democracy. And I don't see any way out of this, and I'd be glad to know that there is one, but I don't see what it is.
Hold on, I'm going to throw it open for some questions in a second. I just wanted to, before we do that, just in response to that, particularly Marietje and Helena, I mean, isn't Robert right that, I mean, Europe internationally can't stand for anything if it's such a reluctant Democrat at home within the European Union?
I agree entirely about the need for reform. And I think it has to be radical reform. I would like us to see that you had a parliament greatly reduced in number, but actually people from our individual national parliaments go to it and come back and have to give account to their own parliaments for what decisions are being made there. Not a separate thing, a whole separate lot of people, and nobody knows who their MEP, their member of the European Parliament is. So I would completely restructure the parliamentary system for Europe.
Briefly before we...
I'm happy I'm accountable for people who voted for me and not for national parliamentarians. I think that is a kind of weird solution for the problem that I indeed recognize of a need for more democratic and actually more political union. You know, that is the consequence if you want to have decision making on that level. But I really don't agree with this notion of a black hole far away from the people. I mean, the steps towards more integration and more cooperation have been made by elected governments. When it comes to foreign policy, these governments, 28 of them, have a veto on decision making. They have enormous power, which is in fact stifling. And I don't think it's a black hole that sits in Brussels. I think it is a lack of sufficient flexibility and sufficient common approaches, actually, that is holding Europe back. It is the notion that, for example, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands has said, like, oh, tough luck for the Southern European countries that they are where they are with the influx of refugees. Well, tough luck. If you have open borders, if you have an internal market, then the consequence is that you have to protect your external borders and you have to do it together. You cannot go on with this perceived difference between the national interest and the European interest. And I think to suggest that there's some kind of Brussels technocratic bunch of people making decisions is very far from reality. It is the member state governments elected by the people of their member states that have by far the most power and responsibility for the status quo of Europe right now.
Okay, thank you. We'd like to hear from you now. If you could put your hand up, and there's a microphone that will wander around to find you, the gentleman over here. And perhaps you could, I'm going to collect maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time, just so we get more questions. And if you could be brief, that would be much appreciated. Perhaps say who you are before you ask a question as well. Thank you, sir.
My name is Željko Ivanović. I'm working with Open Society Foundations. And it seems to me that the topic and the discussion somehow don't really match, because the topic of the conference is about challenges of governments. Most of the talk was about the European Union, with some kind of a notion that it looks like a government or governance structure, and then we heard all the challenges, and there was a talk about UK. Even Germany was mentioned in passing. And I really appreciate your last point about where is the problem coming from, and it comes from very different interests of national capitals, of national governments, who actually make the decisions. And in this sense, I think when Sir Paul Collier speaks about structural identities, this is not only a problem at the level of EU, because even Germany and other governments do not represent a monolith identity. Even within these governments, you have very different identities. You remember probably that Pegida organized a protest, speak German at home, while even Bavarians don't speak German at home. So this power relationship, in my view, need to be reconstructed at national and subnational level if we want closer integration. So I wanted your reflection and maybe a little bit deeper articulation of what did you mean by structural identities. I'm working on Roma issues in Europe. And the situation of Roma hasn't been resolved for several decades by European Union. I have no hope that the European Union will be able to solve the migrant issues as the structural power is distributed as it is because it didn't solve the issue of Roma, which are citizens of all these countries. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Gentleman over here.
Hello, my name is Bo Rothstein. I have a question about European identity. We have been carrying out surveys in Europe asking people two things. One, their perceptions about corruption, and the other, if they perceive that other people in their society can be trusted. And we have sampled based on regions, not on countries. So we have some 200 regions. And the differences are just stunning. It's not so easy to know what people answer when they answer the question, do you think most people can be trusted? But one way to think about it is that they make a kind of evaluation of the moral standard of the society in which they live. Now, the difference is tenfold between the country where we have most people saying trusting, Copenhagen, and the least in Slovenia. And we find the same when people are asked questions about perceptions and experience of corruption. It's just stunning. So my question is, haven't you underestimated how different Europe is in these two very, very central things? How people perceive the moral of their society?
Good question. And any other questions before we go back to... let's go over there. Gentleman over there.
Thank you. Thank you for this fascinating discussion. My name is Valerie Davis, DPhil student here at the school. And I'd first like to say that I'm very sympathetic to the idea that we need to consider, if we're looking at the EU, we need to consider that the possibility of the problems we're seeing at the EU level could be a result of problems at the national level, aggregated at the EU level. And the notion, for example, of having a reluctant hegemon who wants to have all the benefits but bear none of the costs seems to me quite fit, explain a lot of, let's say, the variance of the problems we're seeing here. But my question goes in a bit of different direction from Professor Rothstein's question. Particularly, if we ditch the notion of ever closer union, we're left with the notion of an ever looser union. And given the idea of proliferating ideas of Europe à la carte and overlapping unions of willing member states going in certain directions, where is the point at which Europe of different unions of different countries ceases to be a European Union and becomes something much less? Thank you.
Okay, so questions about trust, about identities. Paul, one of the questions is for you. Do you want to respond to the first question?
I think the questions fit together, that trying to get social cohesion at a high enough level that you got sort of, there's scale economies in some activities, so there's some scale economies in government, and the struggle is balancing the scale economies that you get from larger government against the greater, the reduced cohesion you get as you aggregate. And I think, as Professor Toon says, that the best we've managed so far is something called the nation-state, which is itself, as you suggest, an aggregation, and a relatively recent aggregation. You know, the myth that nation-states go back forever is just a nonsense. They're 19th, 20th century constructions, sort of, but useful constructions, with the flaw in them that certainly in Europe they were built through war, and so Europe got frightened that there would be further international conflict. Now, as it happens, fortunately, globally, international conflict has virtually disappeared from the scene. Pretty well all the conflicts are internal to societies, not between them. So, to my mind, building cohesive national states is actually now very much safer thing to do than it was 1 or 2 centuries ago, because the risk of violent conflict between states has gone down massively. Right? Now, there's still, as you indicate, real problems of building cohesion within societies, and getting identity to move towards power is at best a slow process. It can be done. You know, one of my heroes is President Nyerere of Tanzania, who did just that. He managed to build a sense of national identity over the period of about 40 years. Right? But the quicker way is to move power down towards identity, which is decentralization. Right? The European Union sort of had this flirtation with trying to move power away from identity in ways that are sometimes useful because there's areas where cooperation is handy, and sometimes where it's been disastrous, as with the euro, which, I mean, forgive me, but Southern Europe is not a disaster because of a lack of structural reform. It's a disaster because they can't get out of the box. They can't anymore have an exchange rate. Right? When you just compare before euro and post-euro and Southern European youth unemployment, and you look across Europe at surveys of youth, and youth are deeply pessimistic in Europe, more so than they've ever been. And tackling that pessimism is a really central task, and you know, part of that is reforming the euro, undoubtedly. There was one further question, but I'll shut up and pass it around.
Well, Marietje and Helena, what's your response to the criticism that for Europe to work, we need a European identity that, frankly, is just not going to happen, and that we've underestimated? Professor Rothstein said the trust differentials across the EU.
But, well, I know it's trite, but one of the things that people would say is, you know, I am a Scot, I'm a Brit, I'm a European, because people actually are capable of having multiple identities. And so I actually think that this idea of creating the European identity as if it excluded your other identities is not right. People can chew and walk at the same time. You know, people are capable of doing two things at the same time. And holding those ideas in their head is not an impossibility. But I do think, and I agree with Stephen on this, Paul on this, that it's about you know, the business of power, you know, of trying to draw it to the centre, you know, has been one of the follies here. And I do believe that you have to make sure that the decisions, you know, should be made closer to home, which are the right ones. But there are some, and he was dismissive about the idea of Germany's not going to invade anywhere. Of course Germany's not going to invade anywhere. But the conflicts across Europe, which are the frightening ones, and I go back to our friend who accused the panel, oi! He's busy looking at his papers and not listening. You're being addressed, you know. Maybe you missed my contribution, because my contribution was addressing the question, the neo-geopolitics, which, right? No, I'm not. I'm just telling you it was. You weren't listening. So all I'm telling you is that when it comes to the business, of dealing with certain problems, you have to come together. Now, one of them, you presented the exact one. Where conflict will happen is when nations fearful of migration and all of this business of refugees and so on start being terrible to Muslims. Their Muslim populations across Europe start suffering because they're not protected by their states. Where you start having the business of Roma. We know that has never been dealt with, and the persecution of Roma continues to this day. And so we've got to recognize that there are some of these things that move across Europe as problems which are about human rights. And the only way that you can combat them is by being a unit together. So there's some problems where you have to come together. And that's why, is Europe irrelevant? No, it's not irrelevant in a different geopolitics. It's relevant because there are some problems you can only deal with together. And we just have to decide which are the ones that you keep to yourselves and which are the ones where you have to collaborate.
Sorry, that last point is the key point. But this notion of power gravitating to the center away from the decentralized level it's just not accurate. We see a lot of decentralization, more power being brought to local governments, and on some issues there is a choice to work together, for example, in international trade, to strengthen the negotiating position of the EU. But there are also of our joint economy, actually the single market, to be leveraged on the global stage, which I still think is a good idea because it increases our ability to negotiate well in the interest of our people. But it's under huge pressure. And I think the consequences of decisions that are made on the European level unraveling are unknown to many people because nobody can predict what would happen. And it makes it easy to pretend that the consequences would be little. But I wanted to come back to the theme that I think was in all of your questions, which is trust. And I 100% agree. I mean, I'm at the receiving end of the lack of trust and criticism on decision-making on the European level every day, and I really think we need to make sure that it is more democratic, that people have more trust. But I think we see a lack of trust and a lot of pressure on our entire democratic societies. I mean, look at the tone of the debate in the US presidential election, look at the rise of nationalist parties and the way in which it is setting the tone in the debates on the national level. I don't think that there are people getting a lot of trust from their city councillors, but I could be wrong. Their local level representatives. I think that there's a disconnect and a sense of irrelevance of politics in many cases, crisis of political parties, and really of the system that we have set up to run our democracy, and that we have to look at it in a much bigger way than only at Europe, where of course there are specific problems, and I agree that there are problems with the euro. I don't want to make it a black and white discussion, but I think it is too easy to say that the EU is a failed project, that Europe is something entirely different, that there's only lack of trust in the European level. I don't think that that's accurate.
Should we roll out the euro? Should we get rid of the euro? That would solve it.
You think so? You want to sign off on it? I'm not. I don't.
I actually think, you know, the euro is one of the central problems in all of this, and the power of the European Bank. And I actually think that that is where you would win trust again, because trust doesn't just grow. It comes from transparency. It comes from people feeling that they can see what's going on and that they know that what's happening is taking account of their experience. And I'm afraid I actually do think that the kind of reform that there has to be at the centre is real, and I think that you're in denial about the extent to which people feel alienated from the process at the centre of Europe.
I fully agree that we need reform. I'm just saying we need reform on multiple levels, and I think that there are simplified and stereotypical statements being made about the European level as though it were in great contrast with the trust that people have in national parliamentarians or local politicians. And I think that we face a broader trust and legitimacy problem that we have to address. But I'm the first to admit that there is a problem on the European level, that there are problems with decisions that have been made in the past. But the fundamental choice is, do you conclude from the problems that you see today that you have to take a step back, throw the towel in the ring, stop the project, or do you continue to try to make it better? And my choice is the latter. It's an uphill battle for sure, but I do think that the European Union and Europe are worth fighting for.
Has anybody ever apologised for the euro as it is?
Robert wants to
I haven't heard it, but
Robert, isn't that a fair response to what your comments earlier, that there's a crisis of politics everywhere, not just in Europe?
It's very brave. I respect your courage in sticking to your guns. But okay, you know, you can have local, you can encourage local government and that sort of thing, and to some extent the European Union has had great effect on countries like Scotland or Catalonia or Flanders in encouraging greater regional or national decentralization. But the problem is, as I think you kind of admitted, is the euro. The central activity of modern governments is control of the economy. If you can't control that, it doesn't really matter if you're allowed to choose what colour you paint your trams. It's a matter of what the essential role of the state and of democracy. And everyone, at least everyone I've spoken to who believes in the future of the European project, and Marietje said this, we have to go on and we have to keep struggling uphill battle again, is to create an economic government for Europe. It's been said over and over again by European politicians and by supporters of the EU. But what sort of economic government will it be? It can't be a democratic one. As Helena said, at the moment it's the European Central Bank. Europe's being governed by a bank board, one commentator recently said. And this is going to take away from voters and from politicians the essential control over their economies. Now, you might say, well, that's just how things are in the modern world, we just have to live with it, we have to persuade people it's necessary. But at the moment, that's not looking very successful. Okay, it would be nice to think you could dismantle the euro, perhaps, but how? I don't know how it can be done. Therefore, we're stuck, as I said earlier, in this kind of cleft stick in which we need to go forward, but we can't.
I'm going to take just a couple more very quick questions before we wrap up. Are there any other questions? Lady over here.
Hi. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes, we can.
Hi, my name's Jill Bailey. I'm a change consultant in local government in the UK. And I just wanted to say, I identify, though I live in London, I identify very much as a citizen of Europe. So I think we're asking the wrong question. I think the question should be, the new geopolitics, how can Europe be more relevant? That was my quick question.
Okay. Any other questions? Gentleman here.
Henrik Jacobson, Department of Politics here in Oxford. It seems to me that in discussions about the European Union, we always talk about whether we need more or less Europe, and indeed there's a common criticism of the EU saying that the EU can only respond to the problems it faces by giving us more EU. But of course, as any scholar of government can tell you, there are certainly different ways of organizing government. So for instance, in the European Union, we can see different models collapsing. For instance, there's the more hierarchical model of centralized top-down control from Brussels. Then there's the question, how much egalitarian solidarity should we have? How much money, basically, in recent years, there's been a discussion, should we pump towards the south in Europe? Then there's the question, to what extent, how much common market should we have? And then there's also the question, how much fatalism should we allow in the European Union in the form we perhaps now see in the Brexit debate? And so I see in the debate here, many people have said, oh, we need decentralization, we need more cooperation. So you've told us where Europe should go. But now my question is, where should it end up?
The end goal, yeah. I mean, maybe ask the panel to respond to that, and also throw in, just for a sort of last round here, we've talked about the challenges, the problems, the sort of dysfunctionality of the euro. I think we're all agreed on that. But we're also, I think, pessimistic about what we can change about the euro. But I'd like to ask you all to reflect on at least one thing that you think the European Union could change in the way its governance works that would make a positive difference. Let's put aside British membership of the European Union for a second. What is the governance reform? What area should we be focusing on to improve the way the European Union works? Paul, I don't know if you want to start on that.
I very much like Helena Carter's, Kelly's suggestion that it is. Sorry. Incidentally, I was reminded of why I gave up law to do economics. I liked your suggestion that members of Parliament, of national parliaments, should then be the representatives in the European Parliament. I think that we function in a representative democracy, not direct democracy, thank goodness, but the representative democracy that works, that over hundreds of years has worked, is national parliaments. And so pooling those into a European Parliament, I think, would make a lot of sense. As it is, it's become a license for the extremes. People vote irresponsibly because they know they're not electing a real government, and so who wins? It's the extremist parties.
Marietje, Paul wants you to be out of a job. What's your response to that?
I think he wants to give me an extra job. I think he wants me to go to national parliament as well. But I really would like to invite you, actually, to come with me for a day or two and see what we have to do. And then wonder how on earth I'm also supposed to serve another mandate. And also maybe go and walk with national parliamentarians for a day and see what they're supposed to do. In the Netherlands, a member of national parliament has one assistant. And I can assure you that we break European rules on what normal work week should be in any country. So I think you also have to ask yourself, how ambitious are you about the quality of democratic oversight? I mean, do you want people just to run around between national parliaments and European parliaments to be more visible, or do you want them to do their job well? And my preference would be for the last, but if it makes people trust democratically elected people more if they serve a double mandate, I'm open for it, because I think we need solutions for more trust, but I think it may actually not result in much in practice.
What reform where do you think reform efforts should be focused?
A more political European Commission. I think the idea of one country designating one person just because then we fill the numbers and then being assigned portfolios to fill the numbers is out of this time. So I think it should be more political, and I think we need to end the vetoes in the Council on foreign policy decisions. And I think we need to ensure that there is much more when it comes to economic governance, democratic oversight, to make sure, because I think that is one of the flaws that we haven't mentioned much, that there is an economic union but not sufficient oversight and democratic decision-making to back it up.
Thank you. Helena?
Yeah, I do think the reform that I'm suggesting is the way to go, because I think that the distance between national parliaments and the European Parliament is too great. And I think that why, and I've heard this, Mariette, what you've said, but I'm so busy, I'm so run off my feet, how could I possibly also then be going to the British Parliament, is that you'd have to reorganise the work of the Parliament, of the European Parliament, and you would have it that there was a small cohort of people elected to the British Parliament who would spend part of their month at the European, but they would have a portfolio, so that they would be the person who was dealing with, whatever transport issues or whatever issues it is in their portfolio, and they would come back and they'd have to report to the national parliament about what is happening. And that is a way of getting some kind of interaction. At the moment, it feels too remote to people. People don't know who their MEPs are. And so I really think that some thinking should be done around that kind of restructuring to reconnect the nation with the bigger entity.
Just make one small comment, because we're both politicians. This is a role for political parties as well, to bridge that gap, because I think that's a caveat that we haven't discussed much, but political parties can play a key role in making sure that their representatives on all respective levels are coordinating and sharing experiences.
Robert?
I think there's a difference between historians and political scientists, and perhaps lawyers who are kind of political scientists. In that political scientists tend to think that what is desirable or logically necessary will actually happen. So you say, well, what we need is to do this, this, and this. You have a sort of wish list, and you say, well, it will happen. Historians know, I fear, perhaps it's just me, that things don't always end happily. And I sort of have this feeling, I just sort of had a vision of sitting in Versailles and having a conference in the Chateau de Versailles in 1788 and saying, Your Majesty, it's very clear we have to make royal government closer to the people, and we have to reform the taxation system. And Louis XVI says, that's a jolly good idea, let's go and do it. Well, we know what happened then. And I rather fear...
But when the Baron spoke to King John and said, we would like a little bit of power to be transferred to us, that wasn't so unsuccessful.
No, it was very successful. Then, of course, they tended to have swords and spears. And
the French had a few.
And so I guess I'd have to say, and I don't mean this to be flippant, well, I do in a way, because the fact is I don't know what to do, is what Bertolt Brecht said, if the people don't like their government, then dissolve the people and choose another.
Fantastic. Well, listen, thank you all very much. Remark, I'm going to ask the verdict from one of our students, Alice Wang, who's going to give us her thoughts on whether the questions framed at the beginning have been answered. Marks out of 10, I think, from you, Alice, right?
Hi, everyone. My name is Alice Wang. I'm a Master of Public Policy student here at the School of Government from New Zealand. And I'm one of 120 graduate students who come from 54 different countries. And you'll meet many of us across the next 2 days in the different sessions. So possibly coming from the furthest country away from Europe, observing sort of some of the internal conflicts, I thought actually a better framing of this whole topic is not, is Europe irrelevant, but more what is needed for Europe to flourish. Because what is obvious to me is that there is a lot of difficulties, a lot of very complex challenges, and that government as well as other aspects of society will need to address. So what I thought I would do is actually just summarize 6 things, going back to the theme of this conference, which is challenges of government, to summarize 6 things that I think governments need to focus on in order to make the most of Europe's future. The first is structural challenges. There seems to be very divergent views within Europe in terms of identity, the role of symbols, trust, as well as institutional challenges in terms of Brexit as well as the EU. The second is a challenge of leadership and perhaps governance and democracy. How do governments listen to its people, and how do governments make the best decisions by the government and by the elected officials? The third is a challenge of economics. There's clearly, from Sir Paul Collier's comments, a lot of difficulties and problems with economic reform. And so how do we take the straitjacket of the EU off? The fourth is about diversity. So how do we maybe progress from the sad old men views that have dominated European thinking and politics and to tap into the increasingly diverse views of the European population? Fifth is that Europe faces many pressing economic and political challenges coming from the migration crisis, rising inequality. And then lastly, there was a lot of discussion about cooperation. I think all of the panel members agree that cooperation was important. But I think we can also agree that cooperation is very difficult, especially in light of the challenges of globalization. So in a context where it's difficult to see eye to eye, how can we achieve cooperation between governments and within society, as well as with the between public and private sectors? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.